Hey everybody, thanks for joining White Dog Outdoors and volume 2 of our Euro Nymphing for Steelhead series. Before we dive into today's content, I just want to quickly mention that we are getting toward that 25,000 subscribers, and when we hit it, we are going to be doing a very big giveaway. We're going to be giving away the Diamondback Ideal Nymph 6-weight. This is the rod I use for all my steelhead fishing nowadays, and we're going to be doing a few other giveaways as well. So if you want to take part in that giveaway, make sure you subscribe on the channel, hit the notifications bell so you can see when we get that. We're only about 900 subscribers away from that, so it'll be coming soon. Hope you guys will join us for all that, and let's get into today's video. All right, the first thing I'm going to tackle today is actually something I forgot to mention in the previous video when I was talking about rods. And if you guys saw the previous video, you saw that, I went through an evolution of rods, and some of those heavier rods, they didn't protect my tippet well, and it was because they were heavier rods. But somebody pointed out, and I meant to mention this, it's also because of the action of the rod. So if you guys are not familiar, a fly rod can be a 5-weight, 6-weight, 7-weight, 8-weight, 9-weight, and that's basically a function of what kind of line it would essentially throw, right? So the heavier line you throw, typically the heavier rod it's going to be, and for the most part, the stiffer the rod is going to be. However, when you're talking about rods, it's not just about the 7-weight, 8-weight, 9-weight. It's also about the action of the rod, and the action makes a huge difference as to how that rod performs. So when I'm casting my dry fly rod, it's a very fast action rod. What that means is that it stays stiff throughout the length of the rod, but only the very tip of it is flexible. And what that does for a dry fly is it allows me to really throw a line into the wind and be able to control my casting really, really well. What it doesn't do is it doesn't give me any forgiveness in my tippet or in that rod, and so it doesn't bend very much, right? So with the faster action rod you have, essentially the stiffer it is with just a smaller section at the top that bends, the less tippet protection you're gonna have. So when I broke off on my 9-weight on the Erie Tribs, with my tippet that I was using, a lot of that was that I was using a 9-weight, but it was also that was a fast action rod. It didn't bend down into the rod at all. And so I just want to make sure that was clear. The slower action rods, like a Euro Nymphing rod, will bend much further down into the rod. And that is really, really good for being able to protect your tippet, being able to fight fish, being able to really move fish, right? So that the amount of the bend in the rod, and if you guys notice in some of my steelhead videos, the Diamondback 6-weight really bends, right? It bends really far down, but it's got a really stiff backbone. So it's a slower action rod, but it still has a lot of backbone. So I just want to make sure I cleared that up, and that it's not just the weight of the rod, but it's also the action of the rod, whether it's fast action or medium action or slow action. All right, so when it comes to reels, I think there are a few things that matter, and I'm gonna put them in order of how I think they matter. Okay, the first thing I wanna see is that reel has a really good smooth drag, right? So when I'm out fishing and I got a steelhead that's running, I need that reel to be super smooth. I don't want something that's jerky. I don't want something that's not consistently smooth. If I have a reel that's not suited to the task with the drag, I'm going to run into some serious issues trying to fight and land that fish. The second thing I want to see is that it has a large arbor. Essentially, how big is the spool? Is it tiny where your line is centered toward the center, or is it a larger arbor where every turn of the reel gains more line? And that's really important when you're fighting a steelhead. Yeah, they're gonna run, right? And you need to make sure you've got a good drag to control them. Well, then they start coming back to you. You need to be able to recover that line quickly. If I have a small arbor reel, that's not gonna really work well. I think most of the reels these days are fairly large arbor, but I think large arbor makes a lot of sense when you're steelhead fishing, because you need to be able to recover that line quickly. When that fish comes at you, you need to recover that line quickly and catch up to that fish. Don't ever let that fish get slack, right? Really important. I think the length of the rod, the action of the rod, and the ability to recover line is all gonna make sure that you stay buttoned on that fish. So go with a large arbor reel. All right, the next thing I would say is that It depends on if you're using a Nymphing fly line or if you're going to be using a mono rig. If you're going to be using a mono rig at any time, I would highly recommend getting a full frame or a full cage reel. The Spectrum C, Sage Spectrum C that I am using is not a full cage or full frame reel. But my regulations require that I use a fly line in a lot of sections, so it's not a problem. That fly line is never going to slip through the gap in the reel. If I were to use a very fine mono rig, and again, I think what matters here is understand what size line you're going to be using on your mono rig. I'm using a 15-pound. It's not super thin, and so I still haven't had the issues of the line slipping out through the reel when I have my 15-pound. But if you're going any lighter than that, I think what's important is make sure that your line is not going to slip out through the gap of the reel. You want to make sure that that line's not coming out. Next thing you know, the line's coming out the wrong way, and you're going to be in a dangerous situation trying to fight a fish. So I will be in the market for a full cage reel just to make sure that I don't run into any of those kinds of issues if I'm going to end up using a mono rig. So there are more and more full cage reels, full frame reels coming out on the market. Oh boy, I don't know. What I would say is just Google and do some research into the reels. Here are some examples of ones that I've heard of and that I know have worked well for other people. Sage has an ESN, right? So that's specifically built. A lot of the Nymphing specific reels are going to be built for Nymphing and with a mono rig so that those fine micro leaders don't slide out of the cage of the reel. Okay, so Sage they have the ESN. They also have a trout rod or a trout reel that is specifically a full cage. That's the one that the trout bitten guys really like. That is very likely where I'll end up. We'll see for my reel. But so there's one. I think the Redington Tilt is a full cage reel. I think the Orvis Hydros they've got a full cage reel. So I would just say, do some research, make sure that you get a full cage reel if you are going to be using a mono rig at any point in time. So number one is drag. Number two is making sure I have a large arbor that I can recover line quickly from. Number three is full cage if I'm going to be using a mono rig at any time. And number four is I want to make sure it balances the rod, right? We've talked about this in a lot of our videos, and I don't have a fly line out here right now, but I want to be able to make sure that rod balances in the tip of the cork where my fingers are going to be resting most of the time. A lot of the reels they make these days, they get into this, everybody wants a light reel, and I don't really understand why, because it doesn't balance some of the bigger rods. So talk to your rod manufacturer, find out what weight reel is going to be a good balance for that rod before you go shopping, right? So I talked to Joe Goodspeed. I knew that a 6.5 to 7 ounce reel, 7.5 ounce reel was going to be perfect. I had the Sage Spectrum C. It already weighed in at like 6.8. When I put the line on, it was about 7 ounces, and it balanced the rod absolutely perfectly, which is why it was a good fit for me. And again, I used the Nymphing fly line, didn't need a full cage. All right, so those are the 4 things I'm looking for when I'm going to look for a reel to complete my outfit. All right, so let's talk about leaders and line setups. And this is going to be different depending on how you do things. I've mentioned before that I am specifically regulated in some sections that I fish to have a fly line, so I end up using a Nymphing fly line on my setup. So I'm going to go through 2 different setups. I'm going to go through the setup using my fly line to fit within the regulations that I have to fit within, and then I'm also going to go through the mono rig setup, and they're very similar. So first of all, I have to start with the fly line. So I do use the Rio Nymph fly line. I make a micro loop at the end of that fly line to have a smooth transition through my guides. Because I am limited to a 15-foot leader in some of my waters, I have no way around it. I'm going to have that going in and out of my guides at a lot of times during the day, and there's nothing I can do about that. It is what it is. So I use the micro loop. I'm not going to go through the micro loop here. I do have a video of the micro loop. I'll put that down in the description below, and I'll pop it up right here as well. Wait, which side is it? That side? I'll pop it up right here as well, so you guys can see what that one is. That's my Nymphing, my typical regular Nymphing setup, but I do the micro loop on it as well. So I do a fly line to the micro loop, and then I literally just tie my my leader onto the micro loop. Okay. I am limited to 15 feet for my entire leader length because of the water that I fish. So I use a 6-foot section of 15-pound chameleon, which is basically, it's Maxima chameleon. It's basically just a monofilament line that stays pretty stiff and has some color to it. So I'll do 6 feet of that, and then I go down to my leader material. All right, so when I'm doing my leader material, I'm typically using some sort of high-vis yellow and some sort of high-vis red. I do like the Amnesia products. Some of their reds have not been as bright lately, so just be careful what you get there. But I like high visibility red for a section and a high visibility yellow. So I typically use somewhere in the 15 to 12 pound range for my cider. The thicker the cider is, the easier it's going to be able to see. The thinner it is, the less pull I'm going to have on my line. So I've got my fly line to my micro loop, and then from my micro loop, 6 feet of Maxima chameleon and 15 pound, down to a 1.5 foot section of red cider material that I'm going to connect with a double uni knot, down to a 1.5 foot section of high visibility yellow, which I'm going to connect with a double uni knot, and then that goes to my tippet ring. So far, my leader length is 9 feet, which is going to leave me 6 feet for my tippet, right? So I'm going to tie the tippet onto that tippet ring, down to my flies, and I make sure that I'm within that 6 foot mark, so I keep my leader within 15 feet. If I don't have to abide by any regulations, I'm going to go with a mono rig. So I'm going to use my same setup, except that Maxima chameleon, I'm not going to do a 6 foot section. I'm going to do like a 30 foot section, right? So I'm going to keep that nice, long. It's a little bit thinner. It's going to have less pull on me when I'm trying to like tight line nymph flies at a distance. The one thing I'll mention is that it is a little bit harder to hold. So when you're controlling your line and you're pinching the line in your fingers, especially if you're using gloves in the winter, that fly line is a little bit thicker than a mono rig. So the mono rig is going to be a little bit thinner, might be a little bit harder to hold on to, but it's going to have less weight, it's going to have less sag, it's going to help you keep better direct connection with your flies, and it's going to help your leader not be weighed down so you can see the minute movements in your leader sometimes. I like that setup. I think it works really well for the steelhead in my area. You know, I catch steelhead, you know, they're typically mid 20-inch range all the way up to like 33, 34-inch. My first steelhead landed with a diamondback was a 33-inch fat female that just tried to whip me, but I whipped her. So anyway, that's my leader setup. Hopefully that helps you guys. Okay, so in the leader setups that I use, everything that's above the tippet ring, the fly line, the main line of the leader, and the cider material are typically going to stay out of the water. Sometimes, if I'm in a deeper section, I might dip my cider in a little bit, but anything below that tippet ring, down through the tippet to the flies, is the portion that's going to be in the water, right? So it's mostly just the tippet in the water. So let's talk about tippet, because this is a huge question I get from everybody is, hey, what size line are you doing down to your flies? You know, do you have to go down to 4-pound line and all those kinds of things to be able to get a bite? I think it depends on a lot of things. All right, the first thing it depends on is your rod. We talked about the action of the rod. Do you have a fast action rod that's not going to protect tippet? You might need to go with a little bit heavier tippet to be able to not break off on fish. Do I have a slower action rod? Like this Diamondback protects tippet ridiculously well. I've never seen a rod that protects tippet like this one does. I have been able to turn around fish that were charging downstream on light tippets. And so the softer action rod that really bends down through the rod is going to protect your tippet a ton. So I can get away with lighter line on this Diamondback than I have with previous rods. All right, the next one is, what does my water look like? What kind of conditions do I have for my water? And what are my surroundings? Am I in an area where if I hook that fish and he goes downstream, I can't chase him, right? If I'm gonna be able to hook a fish, but I can't go follow him if he goes downstream, and I gotta make sure I have tippet that's gonna be able to fight that fish, okay? So I think you gotta match your tippet to the conditions that you have. The lower and clearer water that I have, typically the smaller tippet I'm gonna use, because I wanna make sure that I'm not allowing those fish to see my tippet. Another key piece is, how easily are my flies going to sink? I'm regulated to a single fly in a lot of my situations, so I will, now that I have the Diamondback to protect my tippet, I'll go lighter on my tippet to be able to get my flies down, right? The thicker the tippet is, the less it's going to allow those flies to sink. It's more resistance in the water. So the thinner the tippet is, number one, the better feel I'm going to be able to have of those flies, because I'm going to have a more direct connection to my flies. The better it's going to allow those flies to sink, and the less visibility it's going to have to the fish. So if I can get away with it, I'm going to use a smaller tippet. If I'm in certain situations where I'm in pocket water, right? There's not much visibility in pocket water. There's a lot of air bubbles and stuff like that. I'm probably going to be using more visible flies in pocket water. I'm probably going to go with slightly heavier tippet as long as it's not affecting my drift. If I can get away with slightly heavier tippet because I'm going to be more up and down and it's not as deep, I'll be able to fish heavier tippet, and I'll be able to control fish in a difficult situation. The other thing is, what am I surrounded by? Am I in a nice long pool where I can land a fish easily, or I can go down the bank and I can chase that fish? Maybe I get away with lighter tippet because I can follow that fish if I need to. Whereas if I'm in a section where I've got rapids down below me and I'm fishing the tail of a pool just before these rapids, if I hook a fish on light line, I might not be able to turn that fish and keep him out of the fast water. And if I can't follow him, I'm going to lose that fish, right? So I definitely think that I'm probably going to use heavier tippet in those types of situations if I need to horse a fish a little bit more. So another determining factor when I'm selecting tippet is how pressured are those fish, right? If these fish are pressured, I'm not going to be able to get away with heavier line. Anything that they might be able to see is going to turn those fish off. Now, it depends on where you are. If these are fresh fish from the river or from the lake, if they haven't been pressured by people, they are more likely not going to care about your line. But if you're in a highly pressured hole, right? You got people lined up, they've been fishing that hole all day, all week, and that fish has been sitting there. He's watching for line now, right? Anytime he can see that line, he's going to stay away from it. I've seen this in salmon fishing a lot, and I see it in steelhead a lot. In those types of pressured situations, I have gone from heavier line down to thinner line, even line I wasn't really comfortable with, to be able to get those bites. And so pay attention to what's going on. If you're not getting bites and you're using thicker line, try downsizing to lighter line and see if that makes a difference. You know, I think you got to gauge your tippet. I think you get a few different types of tippet, a few different weights of tippet. Right now, my go-to tippet is a 3X tippet, but it is a real Floraflex strong. It is an 8.8 pound and a 203 millimeter, 0.203 millimeters. And so it's the same size as 3X tippet, but when I was out on my last trip, I was using 3X strong, and I was getting 8.8 pound breaking strength, whereas somebody else that I was with had 3X. It was the same diameter, and they were getting 6 pound breaking strength. So I think it is well worth spending extra money in your tippet to be able to get really strong breaking strength at the same diameter. Another thing I'll say is an advantage to lighter lines and lighter tippet is that when you're fighting a fish, and we're going to go through this when we fight the fish, but when you're fighting a fish, the less resistance you have in the water, the better you can fight that fish. So if I've got a nice big thick fly line from like a 7 or 8 weight fly line that I'm using, which most people use in a lot of these situations, as soon as that fish goes downstream and he starts catching and the fly line starts catching in the water, I'm putting way too much pressure on that fish just from the water pressure on that fly line pulling downstream, and I'm much more likely to lose a fish in those situations. The lighter the line, the less resistance in the water, and the better you're going to be able to fight that fish as well. So when I'm going out, I'm pretty much bringing a few options, right? I'm going to choose those stronger tippets at the same diameters, but I'm going to go to maybe, I got a 3X, maybe I'll go down to a 4X, which is around 7.5 pound breaking strength, all the way up to like a 0X, which I believe is somewhere around 15. So I got anywhere from a 15 pound breaking strength down to about a 7 pound breaking strength. And I think if you invest in the better tippet and you give yourself some options of where to go, you'll be able to make adjustments while you're out on the river to be able to be effective. So another piece that's really important is how much weight do I want to use in my flies or on my line to be able to get the appropriate drift to be able to catch the fish. And I think this is, again, very dependent, and this is something that's going to change throughout the day, throughout the piece of water that you're on, is what kind of water am I fishing? What kind of conditions am I fishing in, right? If I'm fishing low, slow, clear water, I'm gonna be able to use less weight, right? I don't need to get down as much, I'm gonna use less weight. If I'm fishing higher, faster water and I need to be able to get down more, I might have to put on a lot of weight to be able to get down into the slower water on the bottom to be able to get to those fish. And so, you know, it really also depends on how many flies am I allowed to have. In my waters, I'm allowed to have one fly. That one fly makes it a problem for me because I can't pack enough weight in those bigger waters to be able to get down to the fish. So then what do I do, right? And Euro nymphing is it's very much against having weight on the line in most cases. I would say if you can get your weight in the flies and you can have multiple flies to be able to fish the water effectively without putting any kind of weight on there, then that is what I would do. However, if you're regulated to having one fly, or you need more weight to be able to get down through that fast, heavy water to get down to the slower water, this is a situation in which I will use a split shot. So here's how I rig my split shot. If I can't put the weight in the flies to be able to get the appropriate drift, I will use split shot. So in my regulated sections, I can only use one fly. What I'll do is I'll still tie a double nymph rig like I would on any of my Euro nymphing stuff, except I'm not putting a fly on my upper fly, on the dropper tag above. I'm gonna tie a little tiny knot in that down toward the tag, and I'm gonna put a little split shot. I'm gonna use as little split shot as I need to be able to get down and have an effective drift, but I might need to put some split shot on that tag end to be able to get down to the fish. And so you'll see in a lot of my steelhead videos, I do have a tag end with split shot. And that is because I need to do that to be able to get down with only having a single fly. The key with Euro nymphing is really getting your flies into the right places and getting the right drift. And so just make sure you have enough weight to be able to do that. Put it in the flies if you can get it in the flies. If you can't get it in the flies, then you're gonna have to put a little split shot on your line. And again, as little as possible to be able to get the appropriate drift. All right, so let's talk about fly selection. And I feel like this can be a little tricky for some people. They feel a little overwhelmed, but to be honest, when it comes to steelhead, it doesn't have to be that complicated. The first thing I'll tell you is that I don't think there's a magic fly out there that's going to be the end-all be-all of any kind of situation. I think in fishing in general, and also with steelhead fishing, in any given situation that you'll find yourself, there are a lot of different flies that can work. I did the mini series on fly selection from my Euro nymphing series, and we're gonna follow a lot of the same concepts. The first one is that you should understand the food sources that are in the river at any particular given time, and you should judge or make your selections based on what you know about what could be potentially in the river at that potential time. The other thing is, I would say, have your fly box cover a lot of different types of things, right? So we're gonna wanna cover different patterns, and I'm gonna break down the 4 basic flies that I bring with me. But you want to have different patterns, you want to have different sizes and profiles of flies, and more importantly, you want to have different weights of flies, right? You want to be able to cover, you want to be able to match the flies and the weights to be able to get the right drift in every type of situation. As I said in my previous fly selection series, the drift is more important than the fly. Getting the fly into the right place and getting the right drift is more important than the fly. So here are the 4 types of flies that I bring. Number 1, and this is by far the most popular, you're gonna wanna have a bunch of different kinds of egg patterns that you can use. So egg patterns are the number 1. The next one is squirmy worms. I give them their own category because I love them so much, especially the pink ones. The next one would be, I think, stoneflies or potentially other types of nymphs that would be similar, maybe some of the smaller nymphs that I don't have here, but black stoneflies are fantastic. And then the woolly bugger. I mean, what can you say about the woolly bugger? It's probably the most common fly. It's the most universal fly out there. It'll catch any fish in probably any different type of situation. All right, so let's talk about egg flies. When I have egg patterns, what types of situations am I going to use those egg patterns? Number 1, and this is going to the food sources, is if you have any kind of spawning going on, whether that's salmon, whether it's brown trout, or whether it's steelhead, Anytime there are eggs being put out into the river, egg patterns are a fantastic fly to use. So in the fall, I'm pretty much focusing on egg patterns. I might try a few other things if I'm not getting bites, but egg patterns are gonna be my go-to in the fall. As it starts to get to be winter, I might phase off of those as the salmon and the brown trout stop spawning. And then in spring, when it gets to be like maybe middle of March and into April, those steelhead start spawning. Even suckers come into in the rivers and they start spawning. Those egg patterns are going to be, again, phenomenal. And so I would focus a lot on egg patterns at those particular times of the year. Now, I tie them in weighted and unweighted versions. So the number one that I used to do is the standard glow bug. This fly, this pink, salmon pink with the flame orange dot, is one that I tie regularly. It is the fly that I've caught more fish, more steelhead on than any other fly. And it was because it was my go-to pattern. It was my confidence fly for a long time. These are absolutely great. You can tie them with some weight by putting a tungsten bead in there, or you can tie them unweighted and, you know, use some split shot on your line to be able to get those down if you have to. I like to have different weights of flies, like I said, because I want to be able to do different things in different situations. There may be situations where I want the weight to be able to get down into the current, but there are a lot of situations, especially I would say in the spring when steelhead start spawning, you're going to see them coming out on the gravel flats. You're not going to want a weighted fly in those situations. I've been able to watch these fish come out onto these shallow areas and actually be able to sight fish them with an unweighted glow bug. And it's basically, depending how far away you are, what type of river you are, but I've literally like dry fly casted these things and like, you know, let it fall into the river about 10 feet up and just let it drift down. And that unweighted glow bug will just come right down through the rocks right to them, and you'll literally watch them go over and pick them off. It's so cool to be able to do that. So having some unweighted and then some weighted flies are going to help you, they're going to help you cover the different situations. You guys probably recognize this one. This is I call it the green eggs and ham, but any of these flies that you use Estes to tie, God, they're so super simple to tie. You literally just wrap the hook a few times and you're pretty well done. I put a tungsten bead on this to be able to get some weight and a little bit of pink on it. Super, super easy. I'll put this one on the channel at some point, probably this winter, but this is the fly we ended up using this fall that we caught I think every single fish came on this fly. It's just a good go-to pattern. So anyway, any kind of different egg patterns are going to be great. I would say fall and spring. Okay. The next one is the squirmy worm, and I really like this one because I can go anywhere from unweighted to packing it with an absolute ton of weight. And these are great really any time of year. I was using them this fall and we weren't around too many fish. I wasn't getting any bites, and we did end up getting our bites on an egg pattern, so I went back to the egg pattern. But again, you can try this any time of year. I've seen success on these pretty much any time of year, but I really, really like them just because I can change. I'll tie them in a whole bunch of different kinds of weights. And so in the spring, you know, I might be on a really small stream where I don't want hardly any weight at all, or I might be on a big river where I really need to get down through fast water, and they've worked so well in so many different situations. The stonefly and other potential nymphs, but mostly that black stonefly, I love this in the winter. I have been on, you know, certain rivers where people are fishing all different kinds of things, and the only people catching anything in the middle of winter are catching them on black stoneflies. I think a lot of that depends on the river you're in, but understand again, if it's a river that holds those stoneflies, steelhead were really key on those types of things. The other nymphs that I would maybe look at are standard trout nymphs, like some caddis. Those are definitely, I've seen a lot of people catching those. We used to call them steelhead candy. And any other kind of trout nymph you can potentially try, but those big stoneflies I really like. Again, these I can tie them light, I can pack them with a ton of weight. I can tie these, so this is a sexy stonefly, and I can tie the sexy bomb, which has 2 different beads in it. And I can make this almost 1.5 grams if I really, really pack the weight on it. Okay, so I really like these in the winter especially, but you can try them any time of year as well. And then the woolly bugger, man, that's just a fly you can use any time of year, any situation pretty much, and they can be really successful. So I do use these a lot for salmon, but I also have caught plenty of steelhead on them. You know, I would say if fish are not pressured, a bigger fly sometimes can trigger them. If they're a little more pressured, I definitely go to smaller and more natural style of flies. So I think if you cover your fly box with, you know, these 4 different types of flies, I think you're going to have more than enough to be successful. I really don't bring any more than this when I go fishing for steelhead. So this is really all you need. The one thing I would say is if you have a pattern that is working really well, you may want a lot of those, because I always bring my fly tying stuff with me on a trip because I never know exactly what I'm going to want to tie. And if you're going through a lot of flies because you're catching bottom or you're hooking a lot of fish, you just want to be able to make sure that you can restock those. So I do carry quite a few of each type of fly with me. The other thing I'll say about flies is that don't be afraid to change up. I say this all the time. The successful fisherman is the one who's going to be paying attention to what's going on, and they're going to adapt to the situation, right? If you're using egg flies and you're not getting any attention on egg flies, maybe try switching to a blackstone fly or a squirmy worm or something else, right? Or if you're using all, you know, like pink glow bugs, maybe try something of the opposite color, maybe something dark, or maybe something chartreuse, really, really bright. Keep changing things up. Sometimes fish see the same patterns over and they don't want to hit it. As soon as you change up to something else, sometimes you will get a bite right away. So, you know, always be paying attention, always be adapting. And I think if you do those things, if you cover your fly box by having a variety of different patterns and different weights of flies to be able to choose from, I think you'll be able to be successful in a lot of different situations. All right, so that is going to wrap volume 2. I'm going to tell you that volume 3 is going to be an awesome one. That's where we're going to go through the different types of water, how I'm going to approach different types of water, how I'm going to approach steelhead in different seasons, and give you guys stories and like real life examples of my experiences on the water. I think that's going to be a really, really good one to help people understand how they might target these fish in a lot of different types of situations. So stay tuned for that one. If you haven't already, I hope you guys will subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you see that these are coming. And then one last final reminder, we are very close to giving away the Diamondback 6-weight, as well as some other giveaways. So I hope you guys will join us for all that. And we will see you guys soon for volume 3 of our Nymphing for Steelhead series.